I've been doing this basically since college. My first job as an intern in my senior year in college was in the billing department of a lab. And that was in 2003. And I've been doing this for a long time. And what this is a presentation of just all the tips and tricks and best practices I've just basically compiled over the years. In the position that I'm in, which is VP of Revenue Cycle Management, I've worked with 30 different specialties. I've worked with small practices, medium, large, hospitals. So I've seen how a lot of different practices and facilities operate. I've seen what works, what doesn't work. I also do a little bit of looking ahead to see what's coming and what you should be looking forward to, and maybe some things that are new and you may not be aware of or just need reminders about. So that's what a lot of this today is going to be. And speaking of that, there's three kind of main takeaways today. But hopefully by the end of the presentation, you're going to get a lot of just insights, some maybe new things that you want to try out as far as just like workflows. And we're going to look from the very beginning, from patient registration all the way to the back end when we're talking about patient collections. And then also we want to talk about like, how do we get the most out of our technology, whether it's just automating and building on additional or adding additional tools to what we've already got, or if we get the chance, maybe we can leverage some AI, which is the newest, hottest thing to get the most out of the efficiency of our RCM. And then finally, I want to talk about how do we track and benchmark our performance, because, if you're not tracking performance, then how do you know if what you're doing is effective? All right, so again, not all this stuff I'm going to propose to you today am I saying that you absolutely have to do. What this really is just like, hey, here's some things that I recommend that I've seen, and you may say, oh, what Doug just recommended is not a fit for my practice. I'm too big for that, or I'm too small for that. But hopefully you'll get some nuggets that you can take back and incorporate into your day-to-day, some new insights and things. But I wanted to start with this, which is, what is the revenue cycle and what all is involved in revenue cycle management? As you can see, there's a lot of links in this chain here, from patient registration all the way to the back end, and we're collecting from patients and then doing our reporting and key performance indicators. And my point here is there's a lot of links in the chain, and there's a lot of weak links that could be in here, a lot of opportunities for revenue leakage and problems that could come up that could cost you money. So we're going to kind of go through just about every one of these sections today and talk about some best practices. And speaking of that, 2025, I think the last time I really did a webinar like this, we were just coming out of COVID, and I was talking about, the ramifications of COVID on the revenue cycle. And now that we're beyond that, we've seen kind of the fallout from COVID, and we're still kind of dealing with some of the after effects. And so the top issues that we are seeing today are listed here. And patient collections has been an issue even pre-COVID, ever since the rise of high deductible plans and the patient becoming more of a consumer when it comes to healthcare and how much out of pocket a patient owes. Focusing on how do we collect, how do we communicate and collect this very complicated process from our patients. And then also we're seeing a rise in denials, like even more so. I mean, the denial rates are going up. We're seeing insurance companies deploying AI to process claims, and we're seeing trending increases in denials, unfortunately, as a result. And then if you all recall, we've had issues finding qualified staff. That's always been an issue, but even more so in 2025, especially coming out of COVID and the great resignation period, where people were looking for other opportunities, and then specifically remote work and how that may affect your practice. And then data and analytics, like how do we get our hands on this data? Like, you hear a lot of talk and buzzwords about it, but like, how do we learn these systems? There's a lot of tools out there, but how do we get our hands wrapped around this? How do we keep it simple? That's what I'm going to do today. Let's keep it simple. Let's talk about what makes sense from a data analytics and reporting perspective. And then finally, security and compliance. Every year it gets a little bit more serious as far as, what we need to do to safeguard our patients' data and making sure all of our systems are secure, especially in light of Change Healthcare situation last year. Every year is kind of ramping up. So there's three kind of core kind of takeaways that I'm going to kind of frame a lot of this today. And the first one is, let's revisit your process. I'm going to ask you to sit down and map your current process as we go through each phase of the revenue cycle. What are you doing today? Like, how are you processing patients at registration? How are you scrubbing your claims? Let's analyze that and look for areas of improvement, and let's redesign this process, and let's figure out what resources do we need for this process redesign, and then how do we kind of get this communicated to all parties so they know, what we're trying to change. We want buy-in from everyone. And I'm going to talk a lot about shared resources too, and making sure that this isn't just on a sheet of paper in a binder somewhere. Let's use technology, cloud resources to share information with each other. So when we're onboarding, training, hiring new staff, this information is easy to get into their hands, easily repeatable over time. All right, so I'm going to talk a lot today about automation, and you're going to hear big words, and and you'll hear these a lot of times. And this could be a turnoff in some cases because you're like, machine learning, gosh, I don't know, am I equipped to really understand all this stuff? But really, we're going to put it in frame it in such like, how do we get the most out of our EHR, our clearinghouse? What AI tools are available to us that we can use to improve our processes, make us more efficient? Because like I mentioned, there are more denials out there to work. There's often less qualified staff. So how do we get more out of our technology to make us more efficient? So we're doing less manual work. And a lot of these buzzwords kind of fit into that, but it's really just a matter of like getting the most out of our technology. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So that's number 2. And then number 3, how do we use benchmarks to track our performance? So it's great to, build a new process, write the process down, get everybody on board, and then, pull in and plug in some AI tools. But how do you know if that was effective? What if that didn't work? What if you spent a lot of money on this new process and you didn't get the return? Well, we're going to talk about using benchmarks to track performance. And making sure that not only how do you stack up against like an industry average, and what does that even look like, but also how are you actually doing over time? Are your numbers, are things getting better, or are they getting worse? All right, so I'm going to break this down in sections. Let's look at the front end of the revenue cycle, and then we're going to look at the back end. All right, so patient scheduling best practices. So here's just, like I said, a few tips. Some things that if you're not doing these today, you may want to consider. Some of these are obvious. Automated appointment reminders have been around for a while. Are we using them? Do you have options to have multiple reminders? I know I often will get an email, and then if I don't respond to that, like in a few days, I'm getting a text. There are different ways to kind of optimize that. And then do you have the ability to allow patients to self-schedule? I see this a lot in patient portals. Some practices do not want their patients to self-schedule. They want to control the process, but then there are some practices that actually would save you a lot of time. Taking phone calls, for example, if you were able to show time slots to your patients and allow them to request one. So we see that as becoming very popular. Scheduling appointment in blocks allows you, especially if you're a busy practice and you're going to have a certain amount of no-shows, maybe stacking and double booking some of those appointments. Virtual care, so telehealth. I know not every specialty can offer telehealth, but there are so many solutions now. I mean, everybody's scrambled to add telehealth to their EHR systems during COVID. So now I feel like just about every system out there should have a virtual option. And if you're going to, especially if you're in a field like behavioral health, primary care, dermatology, that's really suitable for virtual care, you should make sure that you're offering that. And that could be a way to also help facilitate, best practices here as far as getting patients in the door and maybe not clogging up your in-office scheduler and things like that. Also, waiting lists. So what are we doing for no-shows and cancellations? If you have wait lists, then like if you look at the bottom of the graphic here, you can see that some specialties are more prone to having no-shows, and having a wait list or scheduling in blocks allows you to kind of combat that. One thing I did find when I was researching for this presentation was MGMA did a stat poll recently asking practices whether or not they charge a no-show fee. And I thought the percent of yes answers would be lower than it is, but 42% of practices are charging a no-show fee. So that would be something you could look at. And if you did, you would want to make sure, that patient registration, paperwork, all that stuff is kind of updated to make sure that patients are notified that this is a thing. And then make sure that you have your fee structure set up, the protocols lined up as far as like how far in advance are they allowed to cancel or reschedule before a no-show fee kicks in. So I thought that was important. And then also you want to be able to analyze your data. So do you have the information to see what percentage of appointments are no-shows or calling in to reschedule and things like that? And this is an example of an analytics report that gives you a lot of that information. It is something I highly recommend, even if you don't have access to an analytics tool, a data warehousing tool to track this. You should have access to scheduler-based reports where you can, even if you have to pull this in Excel and crunch the numbers to see how many of your appointments are actually arriving, how many are canceling ahead of time, how many just do not show up. And you'll notice here, this is trended over time. So you want to be able to trend this over time to see, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And then is it a bad number overall? Also, it's also important that you're getting the most out of the software. So for this to work, staff has to be flagging appointments correctly. I see a lot of systems where they'll check a patient in the EHR and then that's it. We're not, we're not flagging anything. If the patient doesn't show up, we're not pulling that appointment up and flagging it as a no-show. We need to make sure the staff is fully trained on how to input all that data into the scheduler as the patients come or do not come or call in to make sure we can actually get our hands on the data. All right, so one big change this year, and it's been kind of coming, is the patient collection piece. So I'm going to transition now into time of service collections and best practices there. Just some information for you. In 2025, the CFPB finalized the rule saying, hey, look, we're not going to allow healthcare organizations to put medical debt on a credit report. So the three main credit reporting agencies no longer will flag a patient, or it's not going to hold them from getting a mortgage, or in the past, that would be something that would hurt them. And before that, it was already kind of coming. If it was a lot of the main credit reporting agencies, we're not really focusing on medical bills, $500 or less, so it was already kind of hard to collect on the back end, especially even if you sent it and brought in a collection agencies. And there's so many folks these days with medical debt because of skyrocketing patient responsibility, high deductible plans. So your medical bill is going to be the last thing paid if you've got a mortgage payment, you've got a power bill, internet bill that needs to be paid. So we need to be thinking about that. I'm going to weave that in because the goal obviously is to, how do we collect more upfront and not have to rely on balance billing and sending a paper statement to collect on our services. So speaking of that, let's look at the patient registration process. What can we revisit here? And that image on the left is an iPad image of a kiosk. Remember back in the day, the kiosk was a literal kiosk that you could walk up to and register yourself. Now it's an iPad. We recommend this. Most EHRs offer it. If you're still handing out clipboards with paperwork, that is not an efficient workflow. You've got someone that's going to have to read someone's bad handwriting and key that into a system, and then you've got that same person having to scan documents in. It's just not efficient. This little image here is basically like, hey, let's make sure we've got this full cycle kind of documented. Okay, so not just like, hey, what's our process for checking in a patient? Are we verifying eligibility and benefits? How do we figure out how much they owe at time of service? All this stuff. But it's making sure, do you have an official policy in place to capture this information? Is this policy available to all the staff? Do you use it when you're training new employees, or is this something we're just verbally communicating and hoping that the folks kind of get it right? This is your front line. Okay, so when patients come in, the first people they meet are your front desk, your registration staff. So you want to get off on the right foot. You want to have something where they're not having to think about all the steps, that you've kind of got this laid out for them as far as what needs to be collected when. Is it at the point they call for the appointment? What do you do when they check in? And as you see in the middle here, I've got exception handling. That is really important. So you can make a list of, hey, you got to collect up front. Tell them you need to collect the copay, do this, do that. What happens if the patient does something that's an outlier? What if they say, I can't pay today, or no, I don't want to do that? You need to be able to arm your staff with exception handling. Are we going to allow a patient to be seen if they refuse to pay a copay? What do you do if a patient is being belligerent? You know, so you have to have this kind of stuff, and you need to be thinking through, like, at each one of these steps. If you don't get the information you want, what step do you want your staff to take? What are you going to allow them to do? If they do run into a problem, an issue, an outlier, how do you want them to address that? All right, so collecting from the patients, how do we automate this process? How do we bring in technology to improve this process? So things like credit card terminals that are integrated with your EHR is important. If you think about, everybody has credit card terminals up front, but is that when you swipe that card, does the transaction populate in the EHR, or are you handing the patient a paper receipt from the terminal and then turning around and hand keying that transaction into the system? Most EHR systems have vendor partners where we'll integrate, meaning the transaction will automatically pull into the system, eliminates all that extra time. They will generally match pricing. So if you've got, you know, a current merchant service vendor is giving you really attractive rates, most of the time the integrated partners can offer a matching rate, okay? And that's just gonna save you a lot of time. Patient responsibility estimators are important. It's very difficult to, especially if you are a practice that is doing multiple procedures, it's not just office visits. Has the patient met their deductible? Do they have a co-insurance, a copay? Having a tool that can help you estimate that is important. If you can find one, a lot of times they can query clearinghouse data and see allowed amounts based on CPT and then cross-reference eligibility and benefits. Also giving flexible payment options, prepayments, deposits, payment plans. Having more options helps, and if you remember, I said exception handling. So let's not be too rigid on it, but also make it clear that we need to, you know, collect payment and then give some options. Can we set up our own online payment plans? I see a lot of practices asking for deposits, like flat deposit, because they maybe find it is too complicated to get the estimator working or to derive, you know, out of pocket up front. So let's take a deposit. And online mobile payment options, are they offered at right now? And I hear a lot of practice, oh, my patient population, they're older, they're a rural area, we don't know how to use this stuff. It's a lot of it is, it's no skin off your back to turn this stuff on in many cases, and just make sure you've deployed it. You would be surprised, honestly, a lot of elderly folks that you feel like maybe couldn't use this, they have family members that help them pay their bills, and you're going to get more payments than you would think. As a matter of fact, 78% of consumers, when polled, this was a Navicure poll from years ago, but back then 78% of consumers were willing to provide a credit card to put it on file, and they're willing to receive e-statements and things like that. So even if you have a population that you don't think would be into it, I think you should look into it. And card on file now is becoming even more popular, and people are more comfortable with it. So I was asked the other day at it's an urgent care kind of practice that we like to take our kids to. They said, hey, you know, if we process the claim and the balance is less than $200, can we go ahead and put a card on file, and that way we don't have to invoice you, we can go ahead and charge it. And I signed that, so that's fine, because there's a limit. It's only up to $200 after the claim is processed. I don't have to worry about getting a bill and then paying for it. I'll still get my EOB, in many cases a statement, but it's another great kind of option there for collecting, because your patient is one of your highest payers now. It's not just like Medicare or Medicaid commercial. Your patient is right up there as one of your highest payers. I also recommend giving some scripts to your staff. So give them some information, even if you have to spell it out, prepare scripts for them and let them know. And again, put this in a written policy. Like, when do you want them to ask for the money? Are there reports that need to be run out of the system? Is there a dashboard in the account, for example, that'll tell you if they owe money from a previous visit? Plus, do they have a copay or out of pocket that you need to collect for today? And make sure that you're giving your staff, they're not just winging it, is what I'm saying. Give them something they can go from. And some of these, I put some examples on here, but it's good to have your staff say it in such a way. It's like, hey, the the system is telling me that you owe a balance. So it's not just like, hey, me, I'm personally telling you you owe us money. This is no, these are the claims. This is your previous balance information. This is something that I'm getting out of my system. It tells me we need to collect today. That makes it less of a personal interaction and more of just like a frank, matter-of-fact conversation. All right, so let's transition into charge capture, coding, and claim submission. Our goal here is to reduce revenue leakage. So front desk registration kind of sets the stage. All right, we've got to capture that information. We've got to be consistent. We've got to have an official policy. But then as services are rendered, this is where we see the biggest revenue leakage. Is a lot of times services being rendered are not being translated into the appropriate charges. So then when we file our claims, we may be missing out. So some best practice standards here to avoid revenue leakage is to make sure that we have comprehensive documentation. So are our templates and all the medical documentation set up properly to support our services, all right? Especially if we're doing procedures and things that need to be documented, or anything that's time-based that you need time recorded to support the code. You need to know that. We need to check our templates to make sure that they meet the standards, and maybe doing mini audits, okay? So we also want to make sure that there's a standard set for chart signatures. I know that's a big one, all right? Charts aren't being signed timely. You're having to hold claims. Let's see if we can sit down with the providers and say, hey, look, best practices, Medicare, if you Google it, Medicare guidelines say, hey, look, 24, 48 hours from the date of service, that chart needs to be signed and finalized. Protocols, clear, consistent documentation, protocols for all staff, okay? Including, common procedure templates, checklists, pick lists that you can build in the system. Please, no paper super bills. Coding accuracy. So do we have the correct CPT ICD-10 codes loaded in the system? Is your EHR vendor updating your codes, or are you having to download and install them? Do you understand that process? Are you able to flag in codes that have been expired? Are we able to get medical necessity checked on these codes? So for like labs, ABNs, are we getting those signed? And then technology integration. So please stop using super bills. Is your EHR able to help you charge capture, streamline the process? I keep saying, please stop using paper super bills. And I know it's a popular thing, even if you're using the system to code. A lot of practices will use like a paper super bill as a backup, but all that does is introduce another fail point, because then the providers are not taking the coding as seriously in the system, because they know they're going to circle a code on a super bill. And then you run into the problem of the staff. What if they're not checking the super bills? What if they lose them? It's just, and then it's also going to slow you down. So if we have to stop and look at a super bill and double check every code to make sure it's correct, then there's just more points of failure in that process. Another thing I see common is for practices where they have providers that are going to multiple facilities. So we've got charges in the office. Those are a bit easier to reconcile. But then you also go to nursing homes. Maybe you're going to the hospital, surgery centers, okay? And a lot of times that stuff is being handled and recorded in other EHR systems. But you have to bring your professional components back and bill them out of your office. Do you have a process for that? Or is that just a bunch of paperwork that you bring in and hope that the provider can remember to bring the pay? I see so many times where that's just like coding cards and face sheets that are folded up and crimped up and stuck into a box in the hospital, and then they have to remember to bring it, and they're only bringing it every so often. So we're going to talk about some charge capture tools here in a second. That's going to really help, including some AI solutions, that can help you automate this process. And then also you have to audit yourself, because a lot of times it's going to be right under your nose and you're not going to catch it. So you have to conduct periodic audits to identify these areas. Go back and check, for example, if you're doing rounds at the hospital, let's get a census report or something from the hospital system and then compare it to your EHR. Did all the charges get there? Did we miss any? So otherwise you can have revenue leakage. What we've seen in studies have shown up to 3 to 5% of revenue can get lost because we're not auditing. We don't have a standard protocol. We don't have technology integration. We're doing things with paper super bills. So let's get this part in order. And some things you can do. So I mentioned mobile charge capture. Most EHR systems now offer, there's an image of a phone where you can have access to your EHR if you are doing rounds at a nursing home or hospital, for example, where you can pull up your patient list and add charges to them. That will sync with the EHR system, basically removes the whole paper super bill tracking and hoping that the doctor or nurse is remembering to pull that, bring that back to the billing team. We also want to make sure that we have custom work queues. So I see a lot of times backlogs of unbilled items get ignored. I do RCM analysis all the time for clients who do their own billing. I do in-house billing and they want just someone to go behind them. And I see, well, geez, there's these claims that haven't been filed for a few months, or stuff that never got coded, or charts that weren't signed, and they just kind of get forgotten about. Well, if you have a work queue, basically there's status-driven work lists that most EHRs can provide that will give you a list of unfiled claims with deficiencies. Are you sorting it oldest to newest? Do you have a tickler system that will remind you or force drop a claim if you haven't dropped it in a certain amount of time? And then please, let's have clearinghouse integration. I see more often than I would like in 2025 where folks are downloading 835, 837 files to their workstation to have and not have a direct clearinghouse integration. Anytime you download those files to your local workstation, we're looking at a HIPAA risk. If someone were to take control of your local workstation and you've got claim files sitting there with hundreds of patient data files, there's an immediate HIPAA breach. Clearinghouse integration is a secure way to transmit that data, and it's just a better workflow. I mean, I remember back in the day, in my old days, when I was working at places that would do that, and you would download the file, you would turn around to go upload it to the clearinghouse. Someone would distract you. You get a phone call. You just forgot to upload the file, and it could be weeks before you realize it. You run an aging report, and you're like, man, where are all these unpaid claims doing on my aging report? It's been 30 days, and oh gosh, I never uploaded that file. So that's just a basic one. Integrated code scrubbing. Let's make sure that, is the system giving you prompts if you've got code errors? Are you able to build your own encounter billing alerts? It's kind of an example there at the bottom where you program. There's some that are like medical necessity, CCI edits, things like that that you could base on Medicare guidelines. What if there's a one-off scenario with a payer where you know they want a certain modifier for a certain code, or you know they need an NDC code? Can you build custom alerts to catch that before the claim goes out? And even if you want to get even more fancy, AI predictive denials has been around for a while. A lot of these systems are separate, some are integrated, where it has an algorithm that basically these predictive denials have like pools of just millions of historical claims that they can bounce your claim against before the claim is filed, and say, for example, hey, we found 50 claims that match your profile that all went to this Blue Shield PPO plan in your state that had the same set of codes, same diagnosis codes, and out of those 50, 10 of them denied. So we have a 20% chance that your claim is going to reject, and it's because of this modifier. That's the type of thing you get with AI predictive denials, where it can kind of give you the odds of a denial because it can query all these millions and millions of historical claims and see those trends. And those things get smarter and smarter over time. A lot of times, if it's not an integrated solution, they're going to want like the 837 files to analyze. All right, and benchmarking. So you're seeing the theme here. We're talking about best practices. Then we said, well, how do we take the best practices and automate some things? And then how do we track performance? So I'm going to just give you a few like KPIs as we go and benchmarks. So you can see, well, for your EDI rejection rate, we're talking about claims. How many of those claims are rejecting when you get them to the clearinghouse? And then what does that look like against industry standards? Most clearinghouses will tell you what their customer-wide rejection rate is, and then they'll tell you what yours is. So usually a 5 to 10% EDI rejection rate is standard. So you want to be less than that. We say best practices is less than 4%. Same with days to bill. Like, how quickly are we getting these claims out the door? Like, how efficient are we with charge capture? How efficient are we with our documentation and finalizing and chart signature, and then getting all the coding completed and scrubbed and out the door? So 10 days or more, surprisingly, is the industry average, depending on specialty. If you look at like MGMA, for example. So the goal should be less than 8 days. So within a week of the data service. Now I've done a lot of those analysis. I've worked with a lot of groups where they can get them out the door between 1 to 3 days. And that is like, everything's humming. But then really anything less than 8 days is considered good. And then we also want to look at the time of service collections. And I'll show you a little little graphic here in a sec. We want to track like how much are we collecting up front? How much are we collecting on the back end? The goal is to shift most of your patient collections to the front end. And so I've got a little recommendation here. Speaking of that, what I like to recommend is if you can, and a lot of this is how your transactions are set up in your billing system. Can you isolate every month? You know how much payments were posted in the system, right? Well, of those payments that you posted into your system, how many of those came from the insurance company? How many of them came from a patient? And then can you take the payments that came from your patients and divide them into two more buckets? Of the payments paid by your patients, how many were paid up front at time of service and how many were paid on the back end? Now, I can't tell you how many times I've seen it where those can't be isolated because you're using the same set of transaction codes for both time of service and back end collections. But you should be able to isolate those so that way you can build a tracking sheet like this over time to see how many payments am I collecting from my patients, what percentage of that is of the whole is it, and then how much of those are coming up front versus on the back end. And the goal should be, this is just a recommendation, 70% of your time of service, of your patient dollar collection should come at time of service. And how do we get there? And if you're not there, is it at least trending in the right direction? And then maybe we run time of service collections report by users. So we had a practice one time, you see how I've highlighted or I've circled some of these with a red border where I was working with a practice one time where their revenue was down for about 5%. This was last year in Q1. And we said, well, maybe it's just the first of the year and collections are slow. But no, we went back the year before, Q1 wasn't down that bad. And we were able to see it through a trending report like this. All of a sudden, time of service payments or patient payments in general just dropped for a period of time. That accounted for a majority of the 5% drop they had in just overall collections. And it turns out they had new staff that was hired during that time period. So as we talked through it and I showed them the numbers, I said, well, why is this number lower? They said, oh, you know, we just hired a couple new people up front and oh, I bet you they're not collecting enough. And sure enough, they dug into it and turns out they weren't trained appropriately, you know, which goes back to the earlier in the presentation on how to ask for money. So for the first 3 months of their employment, they just weren't asking or they weren't collecting as much and it cost the practice some money as a result. So for other KPIs, here's just another tip. If you see something trending in the wrong direction, this is an example. I've seen this on average days to bill, where you're doing great and then all of a sudden you have a stretch where your average days to file a claim is getting worse. Well, if you are a large practice, a lot of times it's hard to really find the exact situation. You want to spend hours. So what I recommend is, if you can, take that information and break it down by different parameters and look at different cohorts. So do you have multiple locations, multiple facilities that you're practicing out of, or multiple providers? A lot of times, if you look at that stat and you break it down by location, facility, or provider, you'll see that there's an outlier scenario that's causing it. And it may not be across the board. Maybe you've got a provider who's all of a sudden slow about signing charts, okay? And that's why. Maybe you started doing rounds at a new hospital and you have a bad process to get those charges back to your EHR and it's slowing you down. And that's location 6 and 7 here, for example. So you got to break these things down a couple of different ways to really find the trend and isolate the root cause. And lastly, before we switch into payment posting, denials, and AR, is E&M coding. So I put this on every slide deck. It's still available. If you're worried about overcoding, undercoding, this link here at the bottom will take you to the AAPC tool where you can plug in your numbers. I would recommend maybe quarterly or once, twice a year, take your E&M levels, quantities, and plug them into this free tool and see how your providers are doing and make sure that there's no bad under or overcoding scenarios happening. And then this is a way you can present them the information so it's not just your opinion. This is how they're stacking up against their peers in the same specialty. All right, so let's talk about the back end. So a lot of stuff here, okay? So I'm gonna start with payment posting and we're gonna go through denials and AR. So this one single image is kind of my 4 main tenets of posting best practices. A lot of times posting too is kind of like an afterthought in a practice because you would think, oh, this is the easy part, but it's if you don't do this right, you're going to create problems for yourself. So when I say frequent payment posting being number one, let's not wait till the end of the month and try to post everything at once. Let's not just post everything every couple of weeks. because you're going to be doing a rush job, you're going to be sloppy, and you're going to make mistakes. So let's post frequently, okay? It's a no-brainer, but you would be surprised. And then denial posting accuracy. As you're posting, are the denials flagged appropriately? So especially if you manually post or if you have a mix, are you making sure the denials are recorded correctly? Not just like printed and set down on a sheet of paper, which I see all the time. Oh, here's a denial. Let me just print the EOB and lay it on my desk. And then by the time I'm done, I have a stack of these sheets of paper. But there's no way to track those denials in the system. And then deposit reconciliation. So you've posted the payment, but is it in your bank account and does it match? All right, I've seen so many times where that's not the case. And then your accountant is asking you the difference and you're spending hours finding a needle in a haystack. So if you're posting frequently and you're making sure that the payments that you're posting are in your bank, you're going to be less likely to have a discrepancy that's going to spend you hours. And then closing your periods, guys. Let's close the periods. Let's make sure charges are in the system, payments are posted and reconciled, everything's accounted for. That means the integrity of your reports are there, and it's not something that is just like, you know, maybe accurate, maybe not. And in the middle here, I've got some things that you also, if you can nail the 4 core ones down, let's make sure that, do we know what we're supposed to get paid? And do we have a mechanism to track underpayments? Even if you can't track them on a day-to-day basis and you feel like that's overwhelming, do periodic audits. Take your top 5 biggest paying CPT codes and spot check them. You know, are you getting paid according to your contract? EFTs, are you getting paper checks in the mail? Does that payer offer an EFT? You know, you'll get that payment about a week faster if it's an EFT versus a paper check. And then on the back end, credits, are we posting incorrectly somehow, or are we over collecting at time of service creating credits? Got to work your credit balances. I see this all the time when I do analysis for customers where they're not working their credit balances, and now they've got a ton of refunds due and things like that. And then of course, virtual credit card payments. A lot of folks just post those payments. They forget to run the virtual credit card, or they forget to call the payer and say, stop sending me virtual credit cards. I want an EFT or at least a check instead, because I don't want to pay the merchant services fees. Ways to automate this process. Let's auto post. I know folks don't like to auto post because they feel like it doesn't maybe always work and you got to go fix it. Most systems now have ways for you to fine tune the auto posting process. We call them adjustment rules in Azalea, where if you don't want something accidentally rolling to the patient responsibility, if something is typically bundled in a scenario and not paid and you want it automatically adjusted. I've mentioned the EFTs already. Let's maximize those. I mentioned integrated merchant services already. It takes some of that hand typing and errors that you might introduce by having a hand key in your credit card payments. And then robotic process automation. If you have integrated merchant services, a lot of times it comes with a robotic process where the payment will automatically get applied to the outstanding charge, especially if your patient is paying on account and they've paid the full balance. How many times do you guys sit down and you hand key in your credit card information and then you got to post it to the charge lines? The robotic process automation, it will take the payment and apply it for you. And a lot of times that comes with the integrated merchant services. So please look into that because I know in many cases now, a lot of that work just completely is eliminated from your plate. And you can focus on really bigger items like denials and appeals. Speaking of denials, the top denial reasons really hasn't changed over the years, but you see there's so many different ways that you could get a denial, and these span the full revenue cycle all the way from the front end process. Like, do we have a prior auth? Did we just fail to check eligibility and benefits? Was it coded correctly? Did we forget to file the claim because we're not checking our backlogs, right? Do we not have the right demographics? Are we not asking for the demographics to be checked every time when they come in? Those little things like that are going to create these denials. And then you guys have seen these stats before. How many denials are preventable? Most of them. How many denials never get worked, right? If you're short staffed, and we talked about staffing issues earlier, a lot of times what falls by the wayside are denials and AR. It costs you a lot of money. So strategy and best practices. Calculate, I got the calculation right here on the bottom right. You know, how do you know what your denial rate is? Is it good? Is it bad? And then can we look at it by dollars of gross charges or number of claims? So let's calculate the KPIs and let's look at trends. And if you don't already, the little table there on the bottom is just like a nice looking example of like a cheat sheet of how to work these denials. So don't keep all this information in your head, put it on a sheet, put it in a shared drive. Okay, we use G Drive at Azalea, OneDrive. You've heard of all these. Don't write it down on a piece of paper and print them in a bunch of binders and hand them to folks. It's going to get lost. It's going to become outdated. Put this information in a centralized place and share it with the staff so that way everybody knows how to work these denials, and you could add to it over time. You're not having to reprint the cheat sheets, that at a minimum. And then you can build denial resources. You've got I mentioned the AI predictive denials, the alerts that you can build. So ideally, as you find these trends, you're like, okay, we have a denial issue here with this payer because of prior auth, or we're not coding it correctly. Can you build an edit that would catch it before it goes out? Are we communicating it, or are we just fixing it and moving on? I see that all the time. I don't feel like communicating this. It's faster if I just fix it and move on. Okay, well, that's just going to continue to repeat. It's a common thing. So speak to your folks and find out how they're managing their denials. Are they communicating it to the front end? Are they building anything on the front end to make it not happen again, whether it's a training issue or just an edit that you can put in the software that says, oh, you forgot this modifier, fix it before the claim goes out. Here's some examples of some different dashboards. So you may not have these available to you, but if you look at this, most AI tools and analytics tools can tell you like, hey, how many denials did you get as a %? And then how many of those did you actually fix, then not fixed? And then there's a nice little table there on the bottom left. You know, if you need to present this to your boss, you have executives, a board, you want to be able to present them with this data and share that things are getting better over time. So you want to be able to use analytics, the pre-claim edits that I mentioned, a denials management work list. Please take advantage of that. We have them in our EHR, other systems have it, and I can't tell you how many times it's just not being used because someone's like, I have my way of doing it, but it involves a way that only that one user knows how to do it. So if you're a manager, an admin, and you come behind them, you can't quantify it because it's that one user's special way of managing denials. It's not recorded in the software and not trackable. And then payer portals is huge. So since COVID, payers have stopped staffing people to take calls. So you used to have to, all right, I'm going to pick up the phone and call these people and give them a piece of my mind about this denial and figure out what happened. Good luck. You're going to be on hold forever. They want you in the payer portal, but it's sometimes difficult to get in the payer portals, but you need to prioritize that. A lot of times they get little chats that you can chat and get a claim status, just 10 times faster than a phone call. Do you have your payer portals maximized? Do you have a protocol for who gets access and who's the admin on the portals? It's very important. Denials, resubmissions, appeals, a lot of that is best handled through the portal. And then let's set a strategy, guys. How are we working the aging? Is it just grab whatever? Are we starting oldest to newest? Do you want folks assigned by payer, by bucket? At what point do we start touching the aging? A lot of folks, if you're shorthanded, they'll say we're not going to touch it till 30 days after we file the claim. But ideally, you want to be able to get a system in place where you know your payers. If Medicare, takes about 14 days historically to pay, then you need to start following up on the 15th day. So do you know your payers and how quickly they pay? All you have to do is go back through your history of paid claims and what's the difference between the day you filed the claim and when they pay? What's the average? So if Medicaid, I see a lot of times Medicaid, they'll pay you in a week. So if a week goes by and you haven't gotten anything yet, it's time to follow up. So make sure you have a strategy there and that it's communicated, it's written down, you have your touch cadence. And if you have things that work, like an appeal that works for a certain procedure that you do where they, oh, this isn't medically necessary, and you've got an appeal with all the resources already linked in it, build a library and save it, share it. I meant you heard me say G Drive, OneDrive. Be leveraging cloud-based solutions where you can share, especially if you have remote employees, so that way people aren't using like an old version or something like that. And a lot of times what I like to do, if you're overwhelmed and you're an ager, build some momentum. Do not spin your wheels. Do not start with the most difficult aging item and kill your first hour with no momentum on trying to fix that one difficult workers' comp claim. Start with Medicare, start with the payers you have easy access to fixes that you know that you can build some momentum, all right? So sometimes I'll recommend that. If you're stuck and you've got an overwhelming amount of AR, get your easy stuff out of the way and build some confidence and momentum. So I mentioned some of this stuff, but we want to have action dates and ticklers. The system should be able to be programmed to remind you. So I mentioned that earlier, Medicare, 14 days, 15th day. action needs to be taken. All right, and these work queues should be telling you, please stop running aging reports. Your system should be able to build a list of items that need to be worked. Your aging report, the minute the day goes by and now you're on the next, that aging report needs to be either be run again because more payments have been posted, or it's just outdated. One thing I'm seeing a lot is real-time claim status inquiry. So the system can ping the payer on that 15th day. You're not having a call. So a lot of clearinghouses now are offering this. You may have to pay extra, but it's going to be worth it. You don't have to pick up the phone and call or try to log into a portal where you get the automatic claim time or claim status inquiry where it's pulling that information back into your EHR and telling you, all right, 15 days have gone by, nothing for Medicare. We ping the system or United, Aetna, whoever, and it's still processed or they denied it, and here's what happened. So, and finally, close the loop, guys. So as you're doing this AR follow-up and you're like, oh man, I keep seeing this issue repeated over and over again, go back to the front end of the process, build an alert, do training and communication. It's common sense stuff, but if you just fix it and move on, you're not closing the loop and it's going to continue to happen. With aging, I like to look at it like this. So if you've got aging, the first thing I recommend is to every month at the same time record your aging dollars and put them in the buckets and then do your percentages. So you can see how much is in each bucket. Because A, you want to trend this, you want to benchmark it. We're going to talk about what good benchmarks are in a second. But then you can also find those outliers. So as you can see here, that 121 plus bucket started trending in the wrong direction. But look, it actually started happening several months ago when we had a big shift to the 31 to 60 bucket back in October, November. And if I'm not tracking this every month like this, I'm not seeing these shifts between the buckets. And I may just be aimlessly working my aging like normal. This is where you're going to find the biggest bang for your buck, and you're going to be able to focus in and say, all right, well, obviously I have an issue here in this bucket. Let me break this down now by payer, by insurance class, and figure out maybe where to best focus my efforts. All right, another thing I recommend with AR aging is to track contractual versus non-contractual adjustments, because what you will find is you may have a sparkling AR, but it could be that things are being adjusted that shouldn't be. This could be maybe the system is automatically adjusting things that shouldn't. It could have a rogue employee writing stuff off. I recommend, I call it a 100% adjustment report. Run a report if you can, transactional report where the gross charge and the adjustment are equal, meaning the whole thing was written off. And then from there, why? And then sit down with the staff and say, these 10 items were written off. Here's the CPT code, here's the payer, 100% written off. Was it bundled and not separately payable? Was it a government payer, or it was informational only and you had to write it off, but it's not balance billable? Like, what is it? You may find issues where, and if folks know you're doing this, they're going to be less likely to like, oh, let me just write this thing off because I'm just tired of appealing it. If they know that you're auditing it too, that's also speaks for itself. I'm not going to go through all these for time, but there are some that I recommend. You need to have benchmarks in place and they need to be communicated to the team. And I recommend that you have bonus structures or something in place. So if they hit your goals, they get compensated or rewarded for it. So we like to look at denial rates, days in AR is a popular one, and I put the calculation across the bottom. And then I like to look at aging buckets. So look at some people look at the 90 plus bucket, 120 plus. The goal should be not to have, more than 10 to 12, 15% of your money tied up in those older buckets. Ideally, you want 80% of your AR in the current buckets. Okay, so maybe 0 to 60 days old. So that way you know that you're working your AR, it's not creeping out there and getting unpayable because of timely filing limits. So set what are those goals? Here's just some recommendations. Is the staff aware of it? Are you rewarding them if they hit them? And if they hit them and maintain them, are they being rewarded, incentivized, bonused? All right, back in patient collections. I already told you how difficult it is to collect from a patient if you didn't collect up front, and how this is really hard to have and patients know this. They know, you know what? I'm never going back to that facility again. I'm just not going to pay the bill. I know it's not going to hurt my credit score. So e-statements, if you're still sending paper statements, so right now 50% or more of patients when polled today would actually prefer an e-statement over a paper, and this is for healthcare poll. Over 75% though of practices are still sending paper invoices only and not even giving an e-option or a text to pay option. So it just involves a conversation with your vendor and saying, is this something I have access to and I need to turn it on? How much does it cost? And then you can determine, well, is it worth the cost or not? It usually is, or at least to try it out. We talked about giving your patients more options to pay. A lot of times, if you are sending paper statements and you just don't want to deal with e-statements, QR codes can be added to a statement, a paper statement, and sent out. Is that something you can add? Are you doing things like manually doing small balance adjustments? When you do decide to send people to collections or adjust, are you doing that manually? There should be a way to automatically do a batch adjustment, either through a file upload or through a query that can find those items and write them off. Do you have a policy for patients? Like if they pay cash up front, and do you give them a discount? How many installment payments can they make? Please don't let them pay $1 a month until the balance is paid off. You have to have this officially communicated to your staff and to your patients. So if they owe $1,000, what's the minimum they can pay each month and still remain compliant? Is that looked at and audited regularly? And then if you are going to be calling your patients or reaching out to them proactively if they owe a bill before you adjust it, obviously focus on those larger balances, have a strategy, be flexible with your patients and give them options. And then I mentioned collection agencies. That's kind of the last line of defense. Maybe they can collect. A lot of folks don't like using them because they can be a bit pushy and you're in a small community. So doing all the recommendations I mentioned earlier, or some of them, is going to help you collect more, communicate with your patients up front, make sure they know what's expected so you don't have a bad experience and maybe lose a patient over it. Finally, I want to make sure you guys are not forgetting the maintenance items. All right, so we talked about closed periods, it's best practices, and make sure that all those credits, the payments, you got balance transfers and refunds that you have to think about. Is all that accounted for? Is there a process? Can you close your books and make sure that the integrity of your data is complete? Or are you reviewing your fee schedules, your charge masters? I see this all the time. We haven't changed our fees in 20 years, 10 years. One way you can check that is, remember when I said the 100% adjustment report? Well, you can do the same thing with payments. Are you getting paid 100% of your gross charge? If so, you may think that's awesome, but it's actually it's an indication that your fee's not high enough. In most cases, your payer, even if they're contracted to pay you $125 for an office visit, if you bill them $100, they're going to pay you $100 and not $125. So if they pay you 100%, that is an indication your fees aren't high enough. And the old adage remains true. So if you wanted to just revisit, take your procedures and do 3 times Medicare, 2.5 times Medicare. Your office visit, in-office charges, 2.5 times Medicare as a rule of thumb. You need to be looking at that annually to make sure that your fees are set appropriately. And then that ties in with your contract management. Do you know who you're in network with? What are they paying you? Do you have any payers that are paying you more or less than others? You need to understand what that looks like in case you do need to try to negotiate your contract or go out of network if you're not getting paid, which you need to be paid for your services. And then finally, compliance is really, really important. This is the last slide here, I think, before we get to questions. And I've basically run out of time, but let's make sure you have a written compliance plan. You guys remember what happened with Change Healthcare last year. Do all of your systems have 2-factor authentication? It's annoying, but you've got to use it. Do you have remote employees, and are you treating them like remote employees? Do you have limitations on workstations and shared drives? Are they secure? Do you have protocols for remote employees that they know what's expected of them as far as like paper documentation, shredding, their local workstations and things like that? Coding, making sure that we're compliant there. We're not upcoding, we're not downcoding, we're not unbundling things to get paid extra, things that might be deemed as fraud. Some people may be doing that incidentally and not realizing. If you're not checking and auditing your coding and documentation to make sure it supports, you're going to get in trouble. And this is even more serious than it ever has been. If you don't, even if you're a small practice, if you don't have a privacy and security vendor that you're working with to help you with this, I would recommend it. It's worth the extra expense because of ransomware. It's just happening more and more, even for smaller groups now. So please look into that and make sure you have all this stuff accounted for. And Allie, I only gave you 2 minutes for questions.
That's okay. You were on a roll. Thank you so much. All right, I think we have time for one quick question. If you do have a question, please email us at marketing@azaleahealth.com and we will get back to you. So yeah, one question: which part of the revenue cycle typically causes the most leakage?
That charge capture piece that I mentioned earlier, that's why I even put the leakage image on there.
Perfect.
Getting the documentation translated to charges is the biggest charge capture leakage. So if we're doing, and most importantly, we're doing services and we're failing to record them, and then we're just not billing for them. And that's when I mentioned the hospital rounds. If you're doing in-office procedures, injections, labs, and we don't have a tight process for making sure that's recorded in the documentation and charge capture, then that's the first place to look to tightening that up.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks, Doug. Yeah, we've just got a minute left, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, if you have a question, please email us with anything, marketing@azaleahealth.com, and we will be sending a recording of today's webinar soon, so look out for that. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Doug. And on behalf of
Thank you.
Azalea Health, we hope you have a great day.